All right. Hi, welcome. Good morning, and thank you for joining our Stronger Connections Grant data collection webinar. This will mainly function as a Q&A today, but before we get started, I just wanted to run through the purpose of today's webinar and some norms to help you guys know the best way to ask your questions. So hopefully by the end of today's webinar, you have a good understanding of the pivot that we're making in our new data collection process for the Stronger Connections grant. And then you'll also be able to identify some next steps that will happen to kind of launch us into this new data collection process. So we will, here in a second, do some very quick intros, and then we will jump right in. And I'll have Tanisha, if you're able, I think you can chat to everybody, drop an agenda for today's conversation. We want to be able to address a couple of different topics, but we also want to pause for Q&A along the way since it's a lot of information. So we'll start with just like a general case management update and what that encompasses, and then we'll pause for a Q&A. And then after that, we have just a brief kind of reminder on climate surveys, just to check for understanding and make sure there's not any confusion there. And then we'll pause for Q&A again. And then from there, Tanisha will take over from our EDRS team and just give an overview of data tracking and data collection as we move into this implementation year. And her section will break it up into two parts and have plenty of time to ask questions and be able to provide you guys answers. So for some norms, you should be able to put questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. And then you should also be able to drop questions into the chat, and the hosts and panelists that you see on the screen will be able to receive those. So as we go through today's webinar, feel free to put questions in one of those two places. We will address them either leading up to the Q&A section or during the Q&A section. We'll be able to review those and either answer them in time or answer them during that designated piece of today's webinar. Okay, so I think that's it for norms. We'll go ahead and do quick intros and then jump right in. I'm Sarah McCaslin, the Stronger Connections Grant Specialist at TEA, and I support the Texas Center for Student Supports, our ESC, SCG leads, and then, of course, the 99 awardees that are participating in the Stronger Connections Grant Program. And I'll pass it along to Hank.
I'm Hank Weichert. I am the Director of Student Supports Implementation at the Texas Education Agency, and I support the work that Sarah is doing and that Tanisha's team and that Robin's team at the TCSS are doing. Tanisha?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tanisha Jones. I am a data project manager at TEA. And my role on the team is serving as a data strategist for the Stronger Connections grant and supporting the teams on this call out in the field and at TEA and at TCSS. And I will pass it over to Robin.
Good morning. My name is Robin Terry, and I'm the coordinator of TCSS. And I am just here to support Hank, Sarah, and Tanisha as they help us navigate through some changes. And just to know that the TCSS team is also here to support you in any way that we can. We have a great partnership with TEA, and we're looking forward to making some strides in this area.
All right, we will jump right in. And we'll start with just an overview of our case management updates. And so this has been a labor of love over the past probably year and a half now, when we think about like the conception of case management as we originally saw it. And so to condense, a year and a half long decision into just a couple of minutes, Case management, as it was originally written into the Stronger Connections grant, involved a very robust approach to providing awardees with a state level tool to be able to identify the non-academic needs of students, and then be able to track, monitor progress, identify interventions and progress towards goals and interventions, and then of course roll that data up. And the reason why case management was integrated into the grant was so that there was an aspect of data that could connect to the other pieces of the grant that talk about implementation of the student support framework. So we wanted to be able to essentially measure the effectiveness of the student support framework and the supports and services that you guys are implementing at a local level to see if things like discipline, referrals, behavior threat assessments, incidents of bullying and harassment, all of those data collection pieces were positively impacted by the supports and services that you guys are implementing through this program. So while the original intent was to have more of a robust system, we have, through lots and lots of stakeholder feedback, lots of market research with vendors in the field, and then a landscape analysis across the state, come to a current conclusion that case management, as we originally saw it, is not going to be our next step within the time frame of this grant. That's a huge undertaking, and we've got 2 years for the next steps of what this grant program calls for. However, we didn't want to completely ditch the idea of data collection because, again, it's essential to get the data that we'll look at here in just a second to be able to measure the supports that you guys are implementing from TCSS, the student support framework, and then a lot of times the goals and identified needs that you guys put in your applications and that you've been working towards. The data collection processes that we will have in place can support the data that you need to effectively measure like your identified needs and your goals that you have through this program as well. And so I do want to share my screen really quickly because I think that will be helpful to conceptualize the route that we're going forward. Anybody on the panel, can y'all give me a thumbs up if you can see that okay? Okay, great. So when you look at program guidelines in the Stronger Connections grant program, these three, numbers 3, 4, and 5, are where like the case management and the data collection kind of sit within this grant program. Let's get rid of that. So we have things like the quarterly report of the number of students referred for and receiving services for non-academic needs, quarterly reports on attendance, referrals, removals from class, and then quarterly reports on behavioral threat assessments. As you can see in number 3, this was originally, again, intended to be measured through that state level case management system. While case management is not on the table at this time, the data collection processes that Tanisha will talk about later are still going to capture these data requirements in 3, 4, and 5. So moving forward, you'll notice an errata is going to be released for the Stronger Connections grant, and we will essentially strike through the case management system in number 3, but we still want to hold the standard and the value of collecting the data referenced in 3, 4, and 5, again, so that we can support a holistic program implementation of the student support framework. However, we don't want to leave you guys hanging. And so that's why we're utilizing our EDRS team to create a local data tracking tool and a data collection progress at the agency and TCSS level to ensure that you have the tools and supports needed to elevate this data so that we can do measurements on a statewide and regional level, but so that you guys can also take that data and use it to inform best practices, supports that you might need, and then progress that you're making on your grant goals and deliverables. As it relates to like your FOI performance measures, your SMART goals, and then of course your program assurances to report on this data. I'll stop sharing that. So while we're still collecting this data, the process of course has pivoted, and before we kind of pause here for our first Q&A section, I wanted to address probably the biggest implication of this pivot is the extent to which districts can engage with case management system vendors that are in the field. So at the beginning of this grant, again, the intent was to provide a case management system as an integrated support through TCSS, which meant that as TCSS was vetting vendors that you could engage with Stronger Connections grant funds, since it wasn't integrated support, essentially the answer was no. Case management vendors were not an allowable cost of the Stronger Connections grant program, given that would be a provided support through TCSS. As we embarked again on our stakeholder feedback, our market research, our landscape analysis, we got to a point in the timeline where the rollout of case management was not going to be as soon as we had predicted. And so we went into that provisional year for case management vendors to be approved. And so the guidance was if you were already engaging with a case management vendor at your 3 identified Stronger Connections campuses, you could use Stronger Connections funds to support the continuation of that case management partnership with that vendor, under the expectation that once TCSS released that case management support, you would pivot in year 2, or I guess year 3, the final year of this grant. With what we know now, in case management, not the launch of that not fitting within the timeline of this grant, there's no way to effectively deploy a case management system within the 2 years that we're working with right now. So knowing that, the guidance moving forward is you are more than welcome as a Stronger Connections grant awardee to choose a case management vendor to partner with. If that's something that you believe will serve your campus as well when you think about student support framework implementation and then your identified goals and needs that you addressed in your application. We don't want to give the impression that that's a requirement or that we're advising you to make that choice, but it is an allowable cost. On the flip end of that, we're excited to be able to provide you guys with the tools and resources you need to be able to embark on these data collection processes if you are not in a position to contract with a case management vendor. And again, Tanisha will kind of get into that here in a second. But I think I'll pause here. If Hank, Tanisha, Robin want to add to that, we can add to that. And then from there, I think we'll jump into a Q&A based on that kind of initial information I've given. Okay, great. And then if any of our hosts and panelists want to begin elevating any questions we've seen, we can go ahead and start addressing those. We'll probably take the next 10 minutes. If people want to start dropping questions either into the chat feature or into the Q&A, those are going to be our best bet for answering those questions. I'm scrolling through as well. Okay, so somebody asked, and I assume this is when I was referencing contracting with a vendor for case management, such as Panorama was the question. I believe that Panorama is one of our provisionally approved vendors through the TCSS. So really just as a general answer there, the Texas Center for Student Supports will continue to use their advisory and focus groups to vet any vendors that are submitted through their vendor portal. If a vendor is approved, then yes, you as a Stronger Connections grantee can use your funds to partner with that vendor, again, assuming it aligns to your SMART goals and identified needs. So the extent to which there are case management vendors that are approved by TCSS, yes, you can utilize a partnership with those vendors. Somebody asked, a question, why would it be beneficial for the district to pivot from case management with a vendor to case management through TCSS if what you're doing is working? I'm going to answer it in light of where we're at now with case management, such that, again, case management, as we've envisioned it, as like a more robust system that does account for interventions and goals and progress, that sort of thing, versus the data collection we're doing now, which is a little bit more simplistic, and adheres just black and white to those program guidelines. If you're working with a case management system now with a vendor, we will provide the tools and resources to help you work with that vendor to get the necessary data that's required to be reported on through Stronger Connections into our data collection tool. So as it's positioned now, the tracking tools that we develop through TEA that districts are able to use if they don't already have a case management partnership, or if they want to use this tool in place of it, goes hand in hand with the collection tool. So there's a little bit less of like a crosswalk of getting data from a case management system and helping it work with our data collection system. So there's a benefit there. But as a more high level answer to that question, if what you're doing is working and you have seen success in capturing the non-academic needs and supports of students with the vendor you have now, if that vendor is approved by TCSS and you're going to apply funds to it, then it is likely in the best interest of the district to continue working with that vendor. And again, under the precedent that we'll provide tools to help get data from your vendor to the collection tool that we'll be utilizing through the required data collection of this grant.
There are a couple questions in here about vendors. Somebody asked if Panorama would be able to be used for this purpose. And then just some questions about vendors who are not on the approved list being authorized for use, even if they're not specific to case management. So I think to answer that, with Panorama, you need to be careful because you can use a case management piece of it for these purposes, but they also have climate survey pieces, which would not be covered because we still have our climate survey pieces that we're releasing through Stronger Connections. And then if you do have any vendors that you are interested in having put onto the vendor list, you can have that done through that vendor request form through the TCSS website. And Robin, I think that you shared that back to the hosts and panelists, if you can share that to everyone.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'll put it on everyone.
Another question that we have is whether or not money would be returned so we can use it for a new case management system we have to purchase. Money will not be returned. You're more than welcome to reconfigure your budget workbook. Again, if entering into a contract with a case management system aligns with your SMART goals and identified needs, and you work with your stakeholders at the local level to agree that that's the next best step for you, then you can utilize your budget workbook and the amendment process to account for that. But again, you don't have to purchase a new case management system. So just as the original case management system as we envisioned it when we launched this grant was going to be an integrated support through TCSS at no cost to awardees, the tools and resources that we're cultivating now with our EDRS team are integrated supports at no cost to the awardees. And again, Tanisha will talk about this later, but there will be a local tracking tool that districts can use to keep up with, again, the discipline, the referrals, the outside of the classroom time, the behavioral threat assessment, all those pieces. And then there will be the data collection Qualtrics tool that the agency launches. And those, the tools, the training, the supports, the technical assistance, all of those things are integrated supports via TCSS. Are other vendors not on the approved list being authorized, even if they're not specific to case management? if you submit a vendor for approval through TCSS and they are denied, you do have an opportunity to go through an appeals process. Just be mindful that perhaps they were denied because of an unallowable cost, be it like a supplement not supplant issue or an integrated support issue, which would put you in a bad place with federal funds. If the resource was denied for another reason, then again, you can utilize that appeals process. It does put the district in a position to need to submit a little bit more data around that vendor so that we can assure that the work that you're doing with that third-party vendor aligns to the grant program goals and deliverables. But you can read more information about that on the Texas Center for Student Support's website, specifically their vendor resource page. Another question, would a district need a formal case management system if they are collecting the data necessary to submit the data required in the FOI? So when we look at data reporting through this grant, there's a lot of different avenues to report data because there are a lot of different ways that we want to measure progress of this grant program. So in sum, no, you do not need a formal case management system to be successful in this program. You do not need a formal case management system to report data through this program. You don't need a formal CMS to adhere to program guidelines and assurances. The data that we're asking for comes in a couple of different routes. So we have the data collection process we're talking about today, which again is how we're getting quarterly information on things like discipline, referrals, behavioral threat assessments, and those non-academic needs. We have FOI, which is all about measuring your fidelity of implementation of the grant program as a whole. So looking at those 6 performance measures that are all about the Stronger Connections grant. And then we have climate surveys as well as another means to measure effectiveness of the student support framework. We'll chime in on that here in just a second. But I think that is sufficient there. An example of the data tracking tool provided by the TEA that we can show us. Not at this time. We value stakeholder feedback, and Tanisha will talk about some focus groups that we're going to be launching in preparation for that tool. So while there will be a way for districts to look at and engage with that tool, we want to make sure that we have time on the front end to talk to districts to inform exactly how the rollout of that tool will happen. So yes, we have some startup examples, but we do want input from the field before we just throw it at you guys. And sorry, I'm reading at the same time. I don't want to miss any. We're getting a lot. I'll probably spend about 5 or 6 more minutes here, and then we'll pivot to the next section, and then we can come back to any of these unanswered questions towards the end. When will the local tracking tools be available? Try not to get too ahead of myself. So I'll probably pause on that question and let Tanisha address that because she will go over like a rollout timeline. So we will answer that. I think William maybe asked that. We will answer that. Knowing that the tool has not been developed yet, are we supposed to begin tracking all of the data now or once the tool is released? That's a great question. I'm going to pin that as well, and Tanisha will cover that. But in short, no. We want to be able to train and norm on that data so that we're not collecting anything the incorrect way. I think that's all from the chat. We can look in the Q&A. Somebody asked about contracted services, yes, contracted services are permitted through the Stronger Connections grant. Lynn, I'm happy if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to connect on that further. If you have like specific asks in regard to that contracted service, but usually 6,200 costs are, and we can reference the budget guidance handbook as well. But 6,200 costs are permissible through Stronger Connections. This is a great question. If a district chooses to use a vendor for case management but did not include it in their original application, do they need to do a grant amendment? If a district did not indicate use of a case management system at the beginning, but would like to pursue that route now, because again, we want to emphasize that that's a decision that's being made in conjunction with your Stronger Connections leadership teams, your district leadership teams, your advisory committees that are in place, so that it's you know, an agreed upon best pathway forward. If a district does decide at this point to pursue that route, the only reason an amendment would need to be submitted is if you are moving funds from one budget object code to another that is greater than 25% of your total grant funds. Or if you did not have any funds allocated to that budget object code previously. So for example, if you in your original budget workbook did not have anything in 6,200 because you had no contracted services, then I would be under the impression that most often you would likely be contracting with a case management system provider out of 6,200. So if you're going to put new money in there, then you would need to submit an amendment. Or if the case management system cost is going to be, again, greater than 25% of the grant, or will throw off a budget object code by greater than 25% of the grant, then an amendment needs to be submitted. If from a money or logistical standpoint, an amendment does not need to be submitted, then the parameters that we have in place through TCSS vetting would indicate that that TEA program has no issue with a district utilizing that case management system, knowing that it would already be an approved vendor. And then we would just encourage you again to have those local conversations, talk with your ESC, SCG lead to determine if that's the best pathway. And just as a side note, making sure that you emphasize like how sustainability is going to affect that decision when we think about grant funds expiring September 30th of 2026. When will the data collection system be released? We will talk about that. Somebody's asking about climate surveys. I will touch on that in 30 seconds. Timeline. Lots of great timeline questions. Tanisha will go over timelines. And somebody wanted a quick recap of receiving grant funds back. Whatever a district asked for, money-wise, is what a district received through this grant. So there is no world where grant money is given back to the awardee. But as I mentioned, maybe restructuring your budget to compensate for a potential partnership with a case management vendor that is within the realm of possibility. And again, that is not required. We have the integrated supports through TCSS to provide you with the technical assistance, the tools, the resources that you need to successfully complete the data tracking and data collection. And not such that it's just to check a box off of those grant assurances, but so that you can also use that data to inform best practices and end-time supports at the local level. So is it as robust as case management as we originally envisioned it? No, but we still want it to be useful to awardees. And then last question, and we'll move on. If we purchase a system now, can we pivot to the local data tracking in the new year? I think that question will be answered naturally once Tanisha kind of describes that local data tracking tool and the collection process. What I would say to this is if a district is choosing to use a case management vendor, there is a cumbersome process to get it set up within a district, to train all of your staff on that vendor, to norm on how that case management needs to be effectively implemented. So if there's a world where you're thinking about using something now, but then switching, or using what we have now and then switching, just be mindful of what it takes to implement those systems, and kind of like, just the supports and time and resources that are necessary, even just outside of funds, to implement a case management system, and then pivot so quickly, like at the new year, to something different. Okay, so let's move on to, and again, I see some hands raised. If you can put your question in the Q&A or put it in the chat, we are more than happy to answer it from there. And then the next piece of our agenda is a really quick kind of clarifying piece for the climate surveys. So again, when we look at the data collection that stems from the Stronger Connections grant, we have the data collection of non-academic needs, which is primarily what we're talking about today, that I keep saying that Tanisha will get to, and it'll answer so many questions. I'm very excited. We just wanted to level set first. And then we have the FOI, Fidelity of Implementation, which is a self-evaluation process that districts can use to evaluate their actual grant implementation. So how are our SMART goals going? How are our, training and professional development going? How is grant management going? That sort of thing. And then we have climate surveys. So when we think about measuring the success of a student support framework, it's natural that we can measure the success of SSF implementation through climate surveys. And so the Texas Center for Student Supports has partnered with UT's Institute for Excellence in Mental Health to develop a series of required surveys that districts will implement for the remainder of our Stronger Connections grant, to measure school culture and climate, school climate and culture. And then the analysis is wrapped into that as well. So when we think about integrated supports, the surveys are a required implementation. They're at no cost to the district. And then there is a level of analysis that also goes into that as well. So UT will be providing, again, like I said, just analysis over the different measures and items within those surveys that are available to you guys. So when we think about how we're transitioning like away from case management and into this new data collection process, school climate and culture is completely separate from that. The goal, of course, being that all of these data things, all of these data points inform implementation of the student support framework. But climate was never tied to case management, and it will continue to be, I don't want to say standalone, like it doesn't connect to the rest of the program, but in terms of its support, it's an integrated support through TCSS, which is why Hank was saying earlier, a vendor that applies to be a approved vetted vendor through TCSS who offers climate surveys, that service, or if that's the only thing that vendor does, would be denied to be a part of the approved vendor list, because again, that's an integrated support through TCSS. So that's our note there. Luckily, you're getting so much information on those climate surveys, I believe tomorrow, correct, Robin? Yeah. So more information is coming to you guys tomorrow. Your ESC, SCG leads are prepped and ready to go. They've been working closely with Molly's group with UT Institute of Excellence in Mental Health group as well. And you'll get more information on the deployment of those surveys tomorrow. But we just wanted to make sure that we're recognizing that piece of this grant implementation as separate from case management. Just there were some questions that we got. Robin, I
Sarah,
see you
I
muted.
just want to say a couple things. I've seen a lot of questions like when the checklist, when are we going to see the climate survey? What about the training? Those are very specific to each ESC. So I would advise the LEAs, if you guys would reach out to your ESC lead, a lot of the information is going to flow through them.
So we're going to take our next scheduled pause for more questions. Hank, Tanisha, Robin, if you guys see anything and want to jump, let me know. I'm going to start. If we already utilize the climate survey, do we have to utilize what is being provided? Yes, per program guidelines, it is a requirement to implement the TCSS climate surveys at the 3 identified campuses, or up to 3 identified campuses. When will the climate surveys be launched? You'll get more information that will detail that timeline tomorrow. To be clear, we are not getting the TCSS case management system for this school year or next school year. Yes, Mr. Trevino, that's correct. So how we would all envision a case management system is not going to be an integrated support during the timeline of this grant cycle, so through September 30th of 2026. However, to ensure that you have the tools and resources and supports necessary to maintain that data collection and use non-academic data collection to inform best practices and supports at the local level, you will get a tool to help you through that process as an integrated support. But is it like case management from a number of vendors that we know exist? No, not at this time. Okay, and let me go over to the Q&A. Yes, so there's a question about implementing student surveys through a vetted vendor. Yes, well, that's 2 parts. So, and this is communicated in program guidelines, and it's communicated on TCSS's vendor website. So in an instance where you have a vendor that submits to get approval as a vetted, approved TCSS vendor for Stronger Connections, a lot of these vendors have a lot of different services. So you might have one vendor that is able to give climate surveys, case management, professional development, and training and other technical assistance. To the extent that that service is already an integrated support through TCSS, meaning at this point in time, climate surveys, Stronger Connections grant funds cannot support that because it's an integrated service required by TCSS. To the extent that the vendor provides a service that's like a supplement, not supplant issue, then the district needs to walk that line carefully. To the extent that they might provide a service that's a minimum standard. An example I can think of is reporting bullying. If a vendor has a service that like lets you anonymously report bullying, that's a minimum standard. That's not something that Stronger Connections grant money can support because of supplement, not supplant. And so these questions that are related to vendor services, again, please use discretion and understand that when a vendor is approved, it is always under the criteria that it is up to local to districts to determine what services within that vendor are approved. But what we didn't want to do is just scratch the vendor entirely or scrap the vendor entirely when there were services that we know can support school districts through Stronger Connections funds. If you chose to initially have a case management system, or if you chose not to have like a third-party case management system, but you did allocate funds for it, it's your discretion to just rework your budget according to your identified needs and SMART goals so that you can connect dollars to the work. But with any grant, with this grant, I should say, you're not locked in, right? Like if you put it in your budget workbook, you still have this work. The nature of this work is incredibly flexible. And so just be mindful of that, especially as you get farther into the work of this grant. And you start participating in training, going through some diagnostic services, and identifying some more like intimate supports that your campuses might need. We want you to have the freedom to use your Stronger Connections dollars to support that. So please know that when you think about connecting dollars to the work of this grant. Okay, I think we're going to stop with climate there so that we have enough time to get into data collection. So I'll turn it over to Tanisha, and we will discuss the data tracking tool, the data collection process, and then we'll have opportunities to pause for Q&A before we wrap up today.
Awesome. So I just jumped in with the screen share for the burning questions around timelines, so to make sure that we get to those. But I'm going to just preface the timeline with saying that for the data collection process, it's twofold, right? We have data tracking that happens at the local level, and then we have the collection piece that comes into TEA via a Qualtrics survey. So this table, which was included, I think, in the email invitation that Sarah sent out for this meeting, kind of summarizes when tracking should happen at the local level, when reporting is going to happen with us, and then all the kind of touch points in between. So first off, just wanting to know, there was a question about tracking right now, today. And we say soft launch, meaning that if you have an existing relationship with a vendor already, certainly you can be, you may already be tracking this data based on the grant guidelines. It's not a requirement for Q1. It's more if you are already doing it or have systems in place to do it, feel free to do so. As far as the development of the tracking tool that we are working on collectively at TEA with TCSS and with stakeholder input in the field, that is going to be underway basically starting right now. Y'all have received a survey asking for what is happening at the local level. And if you are interested in being a part of a focus group that will take your input and implement it into the tracking tool. So our as those come in, and I think the deadline to complete that is end of day tomorrow. Once we filter through that information and we create the focus groups, those will happen throughout this month, where a select group of folks from the field will meet with other stakeholders to provide input on this tracking tool. But all the while, the idea is that if you're able to track for Q1, please do so. It is not a requirement. It's a more of a soft encouragement. For Q2 is where an official tracking of data begins. And the tracking tool will be released the week of October 30th. and that will take into account all of the stakeholder input that we received from our partners at TCSS, at TEA, and folks that were a part of the focus group. And there will be a webinar that will go over how the tracking tool works, and there will be office hours, of course, where folks out in the field can ask questions. And then official reporting begins in the first, or actually, I guess it's maybe the second week of January. But keeping in mind that the reporting guidelines, which is just via Qualtrics survey, those reporting windows align with the FOI tool. So the idea is that everything is kind of rolling up at a similar time frame. And so we will send out that reporting piece early January. And then there'll be a window, a similar window to the FOI, where folks will be able to submit those totals based on how you have been tracking at the local level. And so you're not obligated to use the TEA tracking tool that will be that is in development. You have the option to use a third-party vendor. And as Sarah mentioned, making those decisions is largely predicated on y'all's needs at the local level. And then from there, there is another opportunity, because as we know, with the rollout of digital tools, when they're deployed to the field, sometimes we have to make tweaks. And so the goal with the Q3 iteration is that we will have another focus group once y'all have actually used the tracking tool, for those of you that choose to do it out in the field, and actually submitted your first data reporting via the Qualtrics survey. We will conduct another focus group in late January. And at that time, we will release an updated version of the tracking tool and the collection tool. And from there, it should be smooth sailing for the rest of the collections throughout the grant cycle. But your oranges on this table are like keeping in mind like what the quarters are with the tracking, because tracking is kind of an ongoing thing that's happening at the local level. And then you have these very specific windows where you are reporting the data from the previous quarter. So if we're basically tracking from October to December, we're reporting on what we tracked the first week of January, and so on and so forth throughout the rest of the cycle. I'm going to pause there and just ask if there are any questions that I can clarify around tracking versus reporting and the choices that are available and stakeholder input out in the field. Let me see. That will, Dana's question here, will we share the questions that will be on the reporting survey? The goal is to have it be very tightly aligned with the tracking tool. So the tracking tool will really be the indicator of what you can expect to see on the survey. And so I feel like that's, I see Hank was typing, if you want to add anything else, Hank, to that. But the idea is that the tracking tool and the survey tool will be very, very closely aligned. And then it says, will we use data tracking for 23-24 or data collected with the tools TCSS will share for the current year? This one, I would say, so this is like 23-24. So is this the past? For the person that asked this question, is it possible that you could clarify the window here? And then I think we can circle back around to that one. And then will you be talking about the form to fill out online by 9/25? So basically that form, that survey that was sent, the Smartsheet form, that was basically two things. The objective of that form served two purposes: to get a temperature check about what is happening at the local level, in terms of how y'all are tracking data, if you are tracking data. And it's fine if at this point you are not. And then also your intention to use a vendor or use the tracking tool that will be provided by TEA. And then lastly, to gauge your interest in being a part of the focus group. So that is the objective of that form. So just if there are other questions, if there's anything like specific about how the form is structured or anything else, happy to kind of dive into those. Let's see. Okay, so Hank, you got that one about Qualtrics, super. Tracking tool, will one be manually inputting data into a form, or will it be automated? Where participants can, so there will be some manual input, but the aggregates, the idea with the form is that the aggregates there will be automations with the aggregates, because it will essentially be designed in Excel. So it's will have all the automation functions that Excel has available. What else? Let's see. What else can I give you? In the chat, are there any questions over here? I do not see any other questions. Panelists, are any of you seeing any questions?
I don't see anything that hasn't already been addressed.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to just stop sharing here, and then I have one parting thought that I want to make sure that I mention about reporting and collections. So what I would say is that for the focus group, if you indicated interest, you should be receiving a communication sometime toward the end of next week, as we start to pull together the timeline and discern folks' availability around that piece. And then I think those that's like the biggest next step, outside of just making sure to submit your answers to the Qualtrics form by end of day tomorrow, if you haven't already done so.
Okay, great. We have 5 more minutes and we will stay the entire time. So as you still are thinking of questions, feel free to drop those in the chat or put them in the Q&A feature. We have an exit ticket in the chat that helps inform us how we can structure these webinars moving forward to make sure that you're receiving the supports that you need. It's a quick 2 questions. If you'll click on that and participate in that quick survey. Again, to reiterate, when we think about data collection through the Stronger Connections grant, we have the climate surveys. More information is coming tomorrow. We have fidelity of implementation, which we have been rocking and rolling with. And that's been going great. That's really about grant management and implementation of grant goals and deliverables. And then we have the data collection of non-academic needs, which is what we hope to have clarified a little bit today. Case management, as we originally intended, has been a pivot. We're now looking at providing a local tracking tool or allowing districts to engage with a case management vendor. And then TEA will provide the resource via Qualtrics to collect that data. And then, of course, it doesn't just exist we will have analysis, follow-up supports, and then reflections on how TCSS, TEA, your regional ESCs can support you throughout the grant process based on the trends that we see in that data. So we'll be on for the next 4 minutes as more questions come up. Otherwise, you can complete the exit ticket and carry on. We do appreciate your time. Just wanted to say that before we dive into a couple of these other questions.
Q2, there's a question around Q2 data period reporting. It will be Q2 data only, with an encouragement for Q1 if it's available. So Q2 will be mandatory, Q1 will be optional.
Yes, first data collection will take place beginning of January after people have a chance to, get back from the holiday break, reorient. It will correspond to the FOI survey. And it will be at that point in January, you'll be reporting on October, November, December. The FOI timeline, you are receiving information later this week. We didn't want to cloud the field with too much at one time. So yes, there is an FOI timeline. Yes, there will be an updated toolkit so that performance measure 3 no longer reflects a case management system, but rather reflects this new data collection process we're talking about. And you'll get a lot of information this week as well. So a heavy information week with data collection, with climate survey, with FOI. But please reach out to any of us on this call, to your ESC, SCG leads to help orient. If it's leaving you with more questions than answers, that's not our intent. So please reach out for clarification.
That is correct. So just to clarify, will the data collection items be provided to districts that choose to utilize a district created data collection tool? And so, yes, the answer is the data collection tool that will be created via TEA will be provided to all, even if you choose to use an outside vendor to help you with this data collection effort.
Pasting the exit ticket in the chat. For those saying they did not receive it. I'm already getting emails from folks about making sure that their contact is in our listserv. So if you are also somebody who did not receive this data collection email that had that timeline that Tanisha shared